Thank you very much indeed, and good morning, everybody. Well done for making a breakfast meeting. I think it's slightly easier to make it in this virtual world, isn't it, than it would have been in dragging ourselves out of distant hotels and schlepping up to headquarters in Liverpool. But it's still very good to see you, and welcome to this meeting organised by the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform to discuss, I think for the first time at conference, unless you know different, how local government and regional government might have implemented and might implement across the UK electoral reform and proportional representation in some part. And I think we all find that this is quite a timely discussion. The value of local government has really been proved during this period of COVID, certainly in my part of the world, but I'm pretty sure you will recognise that as well. There's been it's also notable around the world that in countries which have strong public health and local government input, there seems to have been a much better response and far greater control of the COVID virus than in countries which are highly centralised. And one of the things that's marked the government's response, and I think not for the better, has been how centralised and therefore confusing their messaging has been, and how ineffective things, for example, like test and trace in England have been, when they could have been more effective had, instead of big contracts being given to the circos of this world, central government trusted local government to do what it does well. And one of those things is public health, and one of those things would be test and trace. And there are already examples of councils up and down the country who've stepped in and have anticipated and improved the response to COVID. But certainly in terms of community activity and making sure that people are looking after each other, it's been ultra local, I think, in my experience as a councillor, which has been most effective. I should introduce myself. I'm the leader of the Labour and Cooperative Group in West Oxfordshire. You'll know that as David Cameron's constituency. And we have a very effective Labour group on the District Council, which is Conservative-led as the largest group, but we make significant input. And during COVID, I have to say, some of those differences between the parties have melted away, and it's been individual councillors and the leaders of the groups who've been making significant contributions to how the council responds, and our officers have been nothing short of magnificent in making things work locally. I'd love to hear people's experiences across the country. One of the other things that's brought this into sharp relief was the impending, and should have been published by now, white paper on local government reorganisation in England. And that, again, caused us to reflect on our role in local government and also the way that we elect people locally. And first past the post is pretty punishing in large parts of the country because it excludes that very strong and cogent and effective Labour voice from being heard in local government. And in other areas, it may be different. Again, I'd love to hear from you. But I think it makes, I would like to think that we would be even stronger had we some form of proportionality at work in electing our representatives at local government. But my experience is of not having proportional representation. We have a panel for you today who have a variety of experience, including the fact that in large swathes of our country, we do elect our councillors proportionally, and that has an impact on both the effectiveness and the conduct of government, but also, I think, asks questions of our national government about their legitimacy in comparison to our more proportional chambers. And it certainly allows that range of voices to be heard, I believe. Let me introduce your panel, though, to you today. We have with us Paul Sweeney, who's the former Secretary of State for Scotland, and I'm hoping that Paul's going to be able to tell us about Scotland's experience of proportional representation at a national level and at a local level. And we have Mark Child, who's the Lord Mayor of Swansea. I was the Mayor of Witney last year. I feel very small compared to the Lord Mayor of Swansea. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? But again, Mark will be able to tell us about the experience in Wales. And then we have Ruth Cadbury, who was just reminding me, she's the MP for Brentford and Isleworth. She knows about proportional representation because, of course, London has a PR system for the Assembly. And it's be very interesting to hear from Ruth on that, but also reflections from Westminster. And we also have Cllr Doina Cornell, and Doina is the leader of Stroud District Council. I'm very pleased that she's almost a neighbour here in West Oxfordshire, certainly the neighbouring county, and she can talk to about what impact it might have on the English local government were we to introduce some form of proportional representation in the way that we run things. So what I'd like to do, if this is okay, is to ask first for contributions and the points of view from Scotland and Wales. So it would be really great if we could start, if this is okay. And I'm sure that my introductions are a bit short here on detail, and I would love people to sort of fill in their CVs and talk about their experience. But I wonder if I could come to Paul first to talk about Scotland. Paul, can you take it from here? And what did I miss out on your CV? Loads of things.
Well, I never got to be Secretary of State. I was only ever shadow, so thanks for promoting me in government. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a really timely discussion, because I think we can feel the constitutional tension that's kind of permeating through everything at the moment, particularly after the last election. I think there's a real feeling of revulsion, particularly in Scotland, at the current government. And that seems to have tipped the balance of support for breaking away and creating a separate state towards it being a majority opinion rather than being a minority pursuit, which has been pretty much ever since I've been alive. But I think a key to how Labour can actually get ahead of this problem and actually present something visionary is to consider electoral reform as a key plank of that, because actually a key source of the tension and the so-called democratic deficit is actually our first past the post electoral system, which produces these massive regional and geographic distortions, which means that you have this notion that certain parts of the country always get governments imposed on them that they don't elect or have relatively little support for, and that creates real difficulties. So I think there is a real need for that to be a key part of our proposals for the future. And it's something that's been a normal feature of Scottish politics since 1999. It took quite a lot of effort for Donald Dewar, who was at the time Secretary of State for Scotland, to get it through Labour Party conference to adopt the additional member system for the new Scottish Parliament, which elects a combination of first past the post constituencies with additional members elected from regional lists using the Hunt system, which is quite complicated, but it's basically that there's two different votes. You vote for your constituency candidate like you would do in a UK election, and then you vote on a regional list for a party. And basically the way it works is there's roughly 9 constituencies per region, and the number of constituencies you win is +1 is used as the divider for the total number of votes the party gets on the regional list, and that's how you break down. So if you get lots of seats on the constituencies, you don't get as many on the list because your vote's divided by the number of constituencies you get, and each round that continues to be added up and then eventually get to all 7 regional list seats being filled. So it's a slightly convoluted way of doing it. And it produces, one of the problems it seems to have produced in the Scottish Parliament is this notion of 2 classes of MSP. And that is quite a tricky situation, because you have this idea that, oh, you weren't actually elected, you just got in on the regional list as a party fix. And you get quite a lot of mockery around that. And also, the two different MSPs don't get the same expenses, so they aren't able to have their own offices, their own constituency or regional office. They have to all be in the one regional office. They get less staffing budget, so they don't have as much support for their offices and so on. So there is actually, in the Parliament's own rules, it actually entrenches this idea that the regional list MSPs don't do as much work as the constituency MSPs. So it does create those problems and that kind of tension. And I think that is an issue that needs to be addressed. There's certainly not a perfect solution. And it was remarked at the time that it was probably one of the most selfless political acts that the Labour Party had ever done in Scotland, because it essentially voluntarily surrendered our political hegemony in Scotland to open it up to the SNP and others to sort of build a bridgehead, if you like, or a beachhead, from which we've suffered from ever since, really. Our votes declined at every election since the Scottish Parliament was created. From around 56 MSPs in 1999 to around 23 in 2016, so it's been a significant fall in support. Also, throughout the Scottish Parliament, there's always been minorities or coalitions. It was very unique in 2011 when the SNP were able to win a majority in that parliament, which is the system's designed for minorities. So when Labour was in power from 1999 to 2007, it was through a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And as a condition of the deal with the Liberal Democrats in 2003, it was agreed to introduce the single transferable vote system into local government in Scotland from 2007, which is basically creates large multi-member wards in each council. So you have 3, 4, 5 member wards in some cases. And personally, I think that seems to work better. I see Stephen Curran's on the call as a Glasgow councillor who might want to offer his view on his personal experience of it. He's probably better placed than me to discuss the practicalities of how it works. But in Glasgow, you tend to have 4 member wards. They're generally 2 SNP councillors and 2 Labour councillors because the way the STV system works in Glasgow. So ironically, it gives us far more support, even though we don't have any MSPs or any constituency MSPs or any constituency MPs in Glasgow at the moment. We still are fairly decently represented in the council with a sizable number of councillors because of the STV system. So in that way, it prevents that horrendous swing where you just everything's destroyed. You know, so ironically, Labour's flattered by the arrangements of the Scottish Parliament and STV at council level because we have far more representation than we would have under first past the post. We'd have been totally destroyed across all levels of government in Scotland if we didn't have it. So in that sense, it does produce less volatile swings, particularly when you get big political upsets like we saw in the UK after the Brexit vote, where you've seen the red wall collapse. We wouldn't have had that massive collapse in support because actually what you've seen under the surface is there's still significant levels of Labour support, but it's just that we've been pipped at the post, if you like, by these kind of, I hope, temporary upsurges in Tory votes because of Brexit, this kind of culture war that's played out. So it does produce massive distortions. It creates large numbers of uncounted votes, if you like, and it doesn't reflect the true underlying support that parties might have in a given geography, which creates these tensions that lead into the UK saying, oh, we need to get out of this country because the Tories keep winning on minority share of the popular votes and so on. So I definitely think there's a case for us moving towards a system. My personal preference is to move to the single transferable vote system and have multi-member constituencies, so maybe have 3 or 4 MPs in larger constituencies. That's my personal preference. Certainly in Glasgow, it would mean that we would have at least 3 Labour MPs at the moment rather than none. So from a personal point of view, I would like to have it. In Scotland, we've got the bizarre situation where we still won around 500,000 votes, but we get 1 MP. You know, so our votes to seats ratio is terrible in Scotland, yet the SNP are able to get 85% of the seats on 45% of the votes. You know, so they're actually grossly overrepresented in Westminster, and that's the idea that they somehow speak for Scotland when they don't. So they actually represent a minority view in Scotland, yet seem to sort of assume this role that they're the voice of the nation. And it's kind of played into by English narratives as well. Like people look towards the SNP and say that's Scotland talking. It's like, no, it's not. It's actually just a bunch of political partisans talking that aren't actually necessarily representative of a majority view in Scotland. So that's a problem, and it further over-exaggerates the tensions that exist politically. And I think that's something that an existential challenge to the UK that we really need to address. There's also difficulties at each level of government. I mean, I think I'm probably preaching to converted amongst councillors to say that, you know, I actually consider standing for Glasgow City Council. I didn't work in politics before I became an MP in 2017. But my employer prevented me from standing for the council because, you know, I wasn't able to basically go from earning a wage of like £35,000 a year to earning £16,000 a year if I became a councillor full time. It basically said if you want to become a councillor, you need to leave your job. And I think there's a real problem there when we expect, you know, young people to try and get into local government, yet they're expected to earn far less than the average wage, and you know, barely earning the minimum wage when you actually count up the amount of casework they have to do and stuff. So I think there's a real challenge. I think we need to professionalise councillors and actually make it into a proper full-time job, and pay them an appropriate salary and give them appropriate support with regards to administration for casework and so on. And I think that way you would actually have a far better vibrancy in local government because you actually turn it into a proper local government where it would be able to sit full-time, actually have committees that are sitting full-time basis, and the balance of power between council officers and councillors would be significantly improved, I think, and it would provide far more scrutiny in local government. and we probably would take on a significantly larger amount of responsibilities. And certainly that's the experience that I seem to have seen in Scotland in the last 20 years of devolution, where the Scottish Parliament's acted as a sort of vacuum that not only brings power down from the House of Commons in Westminster, but it's sucking power up from local government. And you might have seen some reports in the papers about Shetland. We're asking for greater autonomy from Edinburgh, because I mean, you know, Shetland's as far away from Edinburgh as Manchester is. You know, so you know, there's a huge you know, centralisation agenda going on in Scotland as a result of devolution, and there's a sort of narcissism around the Scottish Parliament that's been unpleasant, I think, and has played into nationalist sort of narcissism. So I think we need to challenge that as well. We're looking at reforms to local government and actually moving towards a codified constitution that defines where power should lie in the UK between what would be a federal parliament at Westminster and regional parliaments around the UK, or perhaps an English parliament or a network of home nation parliaments. And then you need to have another tier, which is, you know, restoring the old county councils, if you like, or regional councils in Scotland, and actually have them codified with key responsibilities, which we've seen play out quite well with the city mayoralties. But I think one of the challenges to the city mayoralties are they're a bit like princely states. You know, there's just these kind of barons that they've created almost with huge amounts of power, with like little scrutiny around them. I think you want to actually return to a sort of system where there's more scrutiny there, like almost having city parliaments, if you like. So I think there's a big case for reform in codifying this and sorting it all out. And I think the vision that Labour can offer is to say, look at the chaos of this internal market bill. Isn't it far better by a constitutional convention? It's like said, post-Brexit, the entire constitutional architecture of the UK needs to be totally looked at again from a fundamental level, and actually piece together where this makes sense, and build a sort of symmetrical structure that's codified in a written constitution, and everybody knows where they stand, and you know, there's sort of harmony that's created rather than the kind of lopsided situation we've got just now. So that's kind of, in a rough ramble, my kind of thinking on this. I think it's very urgent that we do it, though. I think it's critical, in fact, to our agenda. I think it's not good enough for us to simply brush it away, saying we don't want to entertain, you know, nationalist sentiments. We don't want to get embroiled in these things. We need to have more imagination about it. We need to have more vision about it and offer something that's more compelling and more, you know, people look at it and go, you know what, that would actually suit me. That seems like a sensible idea, rather than allowing the extreme polarity of nationalism in Scotland and nationalism in England in the form of the Tories and their kind of anti, you know, European attitudes, their sort of Little Englander attitudes prevail, you know, and that's kind of tearing our country apart. And I think the best way we can tackle it is to really adopt a much more exciting vision. And this could be, you know, sort of outlining the architecture of what that could look like. So that's kind of my thinking on it. But I wouldn't underplay the urgency of how quickly and how imaginatively and boldly we need to go at this. We can't wait for the next election, really. We need to have this sorted out well before 2024.
Wow, thank you very much indeed, Paul, and thanks for broadening the debate as well. So too often I think we see electoral reform as about PR in the House of Commons, but actually we're talking about something much broader here, constitutional renewal of the country, and I think that's timely and well thought through. Incidentally, yeah, because I'm leader of the group, I get slightly more than my fellow councillors. I get £6 grand, whereas they get 4.5. So yeah, we can talk about professionalising. I think we have a long way to go. Mark, I'd love you to follow on, if that's okay, to talk about the experience in Wales.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Paul. I might repeat a little bit of what Paul has said, because we have a similar experience in Wales. By the way, Lord Mayor is an honorary title. You get it if you've been there long enough, basically, for a year. I've been a councillor in Swansea since 1999. That's 20 odd years now, isn't it? And I've been, up until recently, cabinet member with social services portfolio. I thought I'd go just a bit of terminology. If I say assembly, sometimes I'll say Senedd, it's the same thing. If they say assembly member or MS, or it's just the same thing. They changed the name recently. I thought what I'd say is what we have in Wales, and it's rather similar, but not identical to what they have in Scotland. What the results have been, which have been vastly different. What the current issues are, and what the future challenges might be in Wales. And I think these may well reflect in Scotland and England and elsewhere. We've had PR, a form of PR, the same form as, or almost the same form as in Scotland, since May 99, the first Assembly elections. It is this 40 constituencies elect by first past the post, then you have 5 regions with about 8 constituencies each, which do a sort of balancing exercise, and I'm glad Paul explained the maths, because it's unfathomable to me. But it attempts to produce a proportional membership of the Senedd, and by and large it has. If there's one party that has gained more than others by this, it is the Labour Party, because we tend to win more of the constituency seats, and however hard they try and balance it proportionately, we still end up with a greater proportion than our vote, although that's narrowed by the exercise. We have, so that gives us 60 AMs in total, 40 constituency and 20 regional. Local government, first past the post in the 22 local unitary authorities in Wales. We have no elected mayors, and we have every area is covered by unitary authority. The results have been that we have had Labour permanently in power since '99, either with a slim majority or in a coalition with Liberal Democrats or Plaid, or working on a minority government. But it has meant that we've had what we might call a progressive government the whole time, in which the Labour Party has been the lead member and had the premiership as well. So on that basis, it has worked. I mean, Labour's always been very strongly, Wales has always been very strongly Labour, but there was fear, I guess, that going into a PR system we might not be, but that has not proved to be the case. We've managed to adopt a system which is detrimental to us as far from the first past the post system, yet remained in power, because there is a natural coalition against having a Tories in power, and we've managed to exploit that, or it has worked in our favour in Wales, in my view. Not that I want to share power with Liberal Democrats or Plaid, but it's better than the Tories have it. Right. The current issues are exactly this, the 2 types of assembly members. You have one first past the post representing a constituency who gets the vast majority of the work from that constituency. And then you have regional members who are able to pick and choose, basically, what they do. And the way it works in Wales is Labour wins a lot of constituencies. Most of the regional members are not Labour. And so we find that, I'll talk about my example in Gower, where we had one Conservative regional assembly member who only did work in Gower constituency, which was the most marginal of the 8 constituencies within their region. And they, in fact, won Gower for the Tories for the first time ever 3 elections ago. Luckily, we've won it back, but it was obvious that they were only focusing on one thing, and that was winning the parliamentary seat in Gower. So it gives 2 different classes of assembly members, the current system. What it has done is preserve the Tories in the Assembly. They would not have won a first past the post seat, or they might have got one if we were just elected on that basis. But so there is a begrudging acceptance that it has allowed the Tory presence to remain amongst some Tory activists anyway. Having a PR system has been to their benefit in the long term in Wales. So although they are trying to reflect what's happening in England, and there's a respect for the system of PR of some kind amongst some Tories in Wales, which is heartening to see, and something we can sort of put a wedge in and try and widen that gap. It has let UKIP in at the last election, and you can say that that's a bad thing. but that's what the people voted for. And to be quite honest, once they got in there, they are such a shambles. It has really exposed them as being useless and not producing anything for the people of Wales or their constituents or whatever. And I anticipate their vote will virtually disintegrate at the next Assembly election, or Senedd election, I should say. Because there are 22 local authorities in Wales, the cabinet member for health or education in the Welsh Government will know by name all of them, and there will be an immediate ability to contact your government minister should you want to. And so there's a large closeness there. Because lots of the local authorities in Wales are also solidly Labour and have been for forever. There is a closeness there which is a hindrance on challenging the way that local government works in Wales. There have been numerous attempts to reorganise in various ways, all of which have floundered on the block of Welsh local government saying, no, we're happy with the way things are, which is a first-past-the-post system, and Labour is the biggest block to first-past-the-post in local government in Wales, I have to say, on my experience. We have toyed with different proposals, but they've always failed. But they keep on arising because whenever the Welsh Government looks at constitutional issues, it comes up that there is a better voting system of first past the post. So what the challenges facing us? Well, we're about to go from 40 parliamentary constituencies to 29 at some point in the future. So the constituencies for the Assembly will not map onto, in any sense, in any way, the constituencies for Parliament. So that throws up an issue. We've got 60 MSs. Because of increased devolution, the amount of MSs that are involved in the government, 60 isn't enough, and we regularly say we need 80 to 90 to form a proper government, a proper Senedd that properly scrutinises ministers and laws and rules as they are being made. We've recently had a report from Welsh Government, saying that we should go down to 20 constituencies and use as you say, single transferable vote system to elect about 85 MSs across Wales. They also said that we should have votes at 16, which I think the Assembly is going to agree on. But it's also saying that we should have PR for councils, but the councils should have the ability to choose whether or not they go to PR, which is basically allowing everybody to carry on doing what they're doing. It's a SOP. It's not government with backbone. But that's where we are. I think there's a majority of the other parties in Wales are for it. Lib Dems and Plaid want a change in the system and want it changed in local government, but there is a block in local government in Wales. Fortunately, it's us. There we go.
Thanks very much indeed, Mark. Okay, that's a very frank and useful sharing. Thank you for that.
Sorry, can I just say one other thing, Duncan? I got it written down at the bottom here. Constituencies we look at now are formed about the same time as we all thought that every property owning male in a first past the post system was a good idea. Because we think that's rubbish anymore, we shouldn't cling to the idea that constituencies designed around that are the ideal. People, when they're asked where they live, they don't give their constituency. They give their town or their city or their county or something like that. And a constituency needs to be where someone spends most of their time, their work, they live, their shop, their leisure. And that has expanded geographically very significantly from when the current constituencies were set up. So I think we need to get away from being locked to this constituency relationship. Has got to be the same geographical size as it is now. Sorry.
That's very interesting. That's a fascinating thing. Yes. So, but not gerrymandering by the same token. So, yeah, thank you. That's wonderful, Mark. With those two very interesting contributions, we now come to the Westminster perspective. And so over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Duncan. So for those who don't know, I'm Ruth Cadbury. I'm Labour MP for Brentford and Isleworth in West London, and I was elected 5 years ago. But before that, I did 25 years on Hounslow Council, which is where I represent now, and I'm, the ward I represented is at the centre of my parliamentary constituency. And can I first of all apologise to anyone who heard me at last night's LCER event, because most of what I'm going to say will be quite familiar. But for those who don't know, LCER is working with other key organisations and other parties to address electoral reform in its widest sense. Now, obviously, we think of electoral reform initially as proportional representation, and certainly that's what LCER has been campaigning for many years and continues to do so. And PR is a subset of electoral reform, and electoral reform is a subset of democratic reform, and you can't really talk about one without the other. And I do want to, personally, I'm not here to advocate particular forms of PR. There are many, and I know one could have a whole day talking about different forms of PR and not agree. AV, STV. I think we do all agree in the Labour Party, those of us who, in fact, 75% of party members support electoral reform. But I think there's a fairly strong consensus that whatever we have, the constituency link is important. There has to be an area link to at least some of the elected representatives. I'm not just talking about Westminster elections. Anyway, so that detail is not for today, I don't think. I hope I don't need to reprise the arguments for PR, for electoral reform. But just very briefly, 19 of the last 20 UK governments have been elected with a minority of the votes cast. And this is appalling. A third of registered voters, some 14.6 million voters, didn't vote in the last general election. And for many, they don't see any point. Their vote didn't count. And when comparable countries have been studied, it's estimated about 5 million more people in the UK would have voted had they been in some sense of PR, some sense that their vote mattered. And it's more likely that those who didn't vote would have voted Labour than Conservative. So very strong reason for Labour to make the change, and of course very strong reason for the Tories in power at the moment in Westminster not to make the change. Obviously, where there's a link between the constituency, a mixture of constituency and list candidates, it means the local link is retained. It does give the voters the opportunity to vote their party allegiance as well as their preferred person, if that person is from a different party. I've door knocked in New Zealand in the general election 3 years ago, where we were getting out the Labour voters in a strongly Labour seat. The MP was going to get re-elected without any problem, but Labour needed all of those votes in order to help get Labour up additional list voters elected. I think, Mark, I think I'd rather be in a assembly, a council chamber, or a parliament with a few Tories and be in power than the situation we're facing in Parliament right now with this appalling Tory government with an 80-vote majority, and they can do whatever they like. So I think I'd rather have have a few of them. And we had the BNP in the London Assembly for a while. They were completely ineffectual. They disappeared without trace. Just a short. I mean, I can't talk in detail about how the London Assembly works, but I just know from being a councillor and being an MP that on my patch, because of our Labour authority being paired with two non-Labour voting authorities, we effectively have got a permanent Tory constituency rep representing us on the Assembly, but I've always got Labour people I can talk to. I think the issue with the London Assembly is it's little more than a scrutiny body, because frankly the mayor has all the power, and that's a different issue that we think we need to address in terms of democratic reform. So we need to look at the wider issue beyond electoral reform, the democratic reform. We need to address the role and the remit of Parliament, democratically elected chamber. I think we have to have, as has already been mentioned by Mark and Paul, is we need a constitutional settlement for the devolved administrations, which have been being ridden roughshod with the Internal Markets Bill at the moment, and also a constitutional settlement for local government. We need to absolutely look at the relationship between government, Parliament and the judiciary. Again, Johnson's government have been appalling where that comes. We need to look at privacy, freedom of information, control of the media, funding of political parties, and of course 16 and 17-year-olds should be able to vote. But even democratic reform isn't the be-all and end-all of better democracy. We have to, good democracies have other factors as well. Good leadership, again, back to New Zealand, excellent leader in Jacinda Ardern. Good democracies have local decision-making powers, which are coupled with local fiscal powers to both make local spending decisions, but also local income generating powers as well. We need parties and politicians that engage, listen and communicate effectively, but I think some form of PR ensures that anyway, because nobody is guaranteed a seat for life. How do we get there? We need to obviously win the election, the next general election, but we need to build towards that with having a democratic convention. So once we're elected, one of the first things we do is set up a full democratic convention, and LCER is working with the other political parties apart from the Tories and the DUP, Make Those Vote Matters, Open Labour, Compass, the Electoral Reform Society, to generate this debate. We've got a meeting at 10 o'clock called Labour for a New Democracy, which is the launch of that, and to pull together what a democratic convention looks like, because I think it's a democratic convention that works out the detail of a lot of this. And I do think that some form of citizen assembly type process, so that we don't fall into the trap that the coalition government fell into, and in fact the Liberal Democrats, who threw a referendum on AV at a completely disinterested public, and the few people who voted frankly didn't think it was a good idea, and how not to make significant democratic change. We have that example, and let's not go down that route again. There is something we should be shouting about now as well, and that's the further imminent disjoint between local authority area boundaries and the parliamentary constituency boundaries. At the moment, some of my colleagues have the misfortune to have to represent constituents in 2 local authority areas. I don't yet, but myself and my fellow MP who between us cover the borough of Hounslow, our constituencies are too large, and Hounslow is now the size of 2.5 parliamentary constituencies. But there's no doubt that I can represent far better all of my constituents in one local authority than have to also represent possibly people in 2 wards in another local authority area. I'd have to get to know a whole second set of decision makers, officers, local community networks, and so on. And I think I'd be representing fewer people less well than more people well, as I do at the moment. And I've gone through this in the local government review as well, in Hounslow, where I was the sort of lead on the Labour group for the ward rewarding. And the crazy way we had to kind of work out a boundary down the middle of the town of Brentford, and you know, it was just split in two. And again, I think as Marcus said, you know, whether they're ward boundaries or parliamentary constituency boundaries or whatever, they do have to reflect the local area. And for those of us in Parliament, we should be only representing people in one local authority area wherever possible. And that's more important than this plus or minus 5% tolerance, which is far too small and makes for some crazy decisions. Very briefly, what you can do if you're not already an LCER member, please join. Make sure your CLP has policy, and do encourage, if you've got a Labour MP or you're friends with a Labour MP, do encourage them to join LCER, because there's only a few of us who are actually paid up members of LCER in the PLP at the moment, and but there's lots of support for reform among MPs, actually of all parties apart from the Tories and the DUP. So please encourage your MP to join up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. It's interesting the point about the sort of link between tiers of government. We're lucky enough to live in a constituency which is also a single district. We're unlucky in the fact that we have a Conservative MP and a large Conservative majority in that Westminster position, and also relatively poor links, even though he's a former district councillor. So there's pluses and minuses, I guess, but that's really good. Thank you, Michael, for your comment, by the way. I'm going to come to Doina next and to talk about local government across England, and then open it up to questions, if that's okay. If people want to put them in the chat, that's fine, or just indicate with a hand once Doina's had a chance to share her thoughts, if that's okay. So over to you, Doina.
Thank you. That's a tough act to follow. There's really interesting points. Hello. So I think you just said at the beginning, my name's Doina Cornell and leader of Stroud District Council. I've been a district councillor for 8 years, representing the market town of Dursley in Gloucestershire, and leader for the last 2.5 years now. So I thought I was sort of asked to talk about the role of councillors sort of in relation to this whole debate. So I've got sort of 3 elements to what I'll say, and I'm conscious we want to leave some time for discussion as well. So one, just generally speaking about the role of councillors. Secondly, I'll explain a little bit more about the particular situation in our districts. I think that's quite pertinent to the debate. And thirdly, I'll just touch on the whole thing that's happening around local government reorganisation and potentially the white paper or not that's supposed to be coming from government at some point. So on a very broad sense, I would say where councillors can be significant in this, I mean, like we use our council as example, we've passed a motion in support of votes at 16, is that we're always influencers, and I think we're embedded in our local communities. So if this debate we were aiming to get by 2024 Labour councillors and the party very much on board, I think all councillors and candidates, we've got significant local elections coming up next year in many parts of the country, including our own, have an important role to play in administration, but equally in opposition. So I think that's where I would see a key role for councillors to use that platform that we have by being local elected representatives to sort of put that case. So I think that's what I would say about that. I wanted to talk a little bit about Stroud District Council particularly, because I think it's quite interesting. So as I said, I've been a councillor for 8 years, and Stroud District is politically an extremely diverse district. We're a very marginal constituency, which was Labour. Unfortunately, we lost just in 2019. We now have a Conservative MP. But we have on our council of 51, we have quite a large Green group. We have Liberal Democrats, Conservatives, the largest party, Labour second. But for the last 8 years, because there is a council that's no overall control, we've been running what we call a cooperative alliance, which is Labour, Lib Dems and Greens working together. So I think what I wanted to talk about was one of the things I get back as an argument often is this perception that working in an alliance, which is potentially the outcome when you have some form of proportional representation or that type of voting system, is generally speaking perceived as weak in this country. So I think we haven't perhaps talked a bit about what the barriers might be to persuading more people. I know you said that most members of the party are supportive of reform, but what's the situation out there with the average voter? from a Labour point of view. So I think we're quite an interesting experiment in what it looks like. And so I would say that it's very hard work to be the leader of an administration like that. But one of the key things is I do think you tend to work out all the difficulties in advance. I think one thing you can see quite clearly with this government, which tries to hold on to all the power very centrally, what happens is it makes a decision and then it has to deal with all the flack. What tends to happen in our council is you work it all out and all the difficulties with your allies, and then hopefully when you get to make the decision, you've pretty much done all that hard work. It is difficult. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but no system would exactly be perfect. But I think it's a good example that it can work. And I just use the example of what happened when we saw that there was the major issue with COVID. We made a decision because we had no opportunity to meet or have any decision-making powers. We worked with the 4 group leaders, myself, the Greens and Lib Dems, who were part of the alliance, but also we brought the Conservative leader in, and so we had several meetings a week with all the 4 group leaders and the chief executive of the council in those early days when we needed to make decisions very rapidly. And I think that made for better outcomes, and there's much evidence, isn't there, to show the more diverse you have a body, better decisions are made. And I think it's a stark contrast between what we were doing with our council and what we've seen shambolically, the response to that. And I think quite key to that is that inability to work with others. So I think we mustn't just look at the system reform, but also what sort of outcome do we want to see. And although it's hard work, I do think generally speaking, and we can probably see other examples across the world where that more inclusive way of working is actually in the end what it's all about is, do we get better outcomes? Is it better for people? And I think there's a lot to be made for that. And I think that's where the case should be looked at. Look at those examples and understand them and sort of start to chip away at that idea that it's weak, as I said, to have an alliance, because that seems to be quite pervasive in this country. And we don't have very good examples, unfortunately. The coalition government wasn't a terribly positive example, but I think there are other examples where you can see that. There are some downsides to it. I mean, I think the fact that there's very small parties, we've only got 2 Lib Dem councillors, which is not, they call themselves a group, it's not quite a group, I suppose. They can sometimes have an undue influence. And I think as a Labour leader, if you did particularly want to put forward some quite strong policy where having to get your allies on board is more challenging, there can be difficulties with that. But overall, I would say that's important, because when you get really into the nuts and bolts of local government, of course, there's some very clear lines between different parties, but often there's a huge amount of common ground. I mean, again, the COVID would be a good example. It doesn't really divide us politically, does it? There's a great deal of unity there. And so often you can find that common ground that you can work through and get good decision making. So that's something about what the Stroud District Council example is, so I think that's important to look at that sort of thing. And then I think the third element I wanted to say was around, more generally speaking, what's happening in local government. And I think there's some really interesting work that's been done in the last few months, because we've had on our radar, we've had a slight feverish summer, not just over COVID, but also a lot of discussion in the networks that I tap into with council leaders across the country is, what is the government proposing in this white paper called Devolution and Local Government Reorganisation, though where the devolution element of it is, I'm really quite unclear, because all the talk has been about reorganising government, I say in England, into different units, but really I haven't seen in there any discussion around actually devolving powers down. As we understand it, the government's perhaps getting a little bit cold feet, I think largely because there's been a huge amount of internal opposition to it, because the proposals, if they went ahead, as we understood earlier on in the summer, were being considered, was to basically unitarise the remaining parts of local government which were still in the 2-tier system with districts and county, to bring them all into huge county units. And the county council network was lobbying very hard for that, in some cases to be looking at one council representing over 1 million people, so really large units. So the district council network, which is actually led by Conservatives, because I'm quite a rare breed in the sense of being a Labour leader of district council, we don't have many of those, has been really vehemently opposed to this. So I think some really good studies have been done by the district council network, definitely worth looking at, around local government organisation, and they've picked up on a couple of things which I think there's a lot of evidence for. What they've done is they've gone and looked at other countries and how local government is organised, and England is already a real outlier in the world on our existing system, that we have much larger units on average, and so councillors represent much larger numbers of people. if you go to, you could just look at in Europe to see France and Germany and other places, even places like Luxembourg, very small population, but have lots of municipalities, lots of very small scale councils. And what you also see related to that is much better democratic engagement. So one of the things there's quite a bit of evidence for is that the larger the unit, the more people are disengaged from the democratic process. Voter turnout in elections is lower, and obviously it's harder to engage with whoever your local representative is. So there's a great deal of evidence to show that size does matter when it comes to the democracy. So I think that when you talk about electoral reform, I think that's already been touched on by other speakers, it's got to be looking at it in the round. There tends to be a fixation on just about Westminster and how many MPs or what sort of MPs we're going to get back to the House of Commons, but I think really for it to be done properly, it needs to be all the way down to the bottom, and also looking at the final layer of local government, which is town and parish councils as well, which comes to the other point I wanted to make about the representation. Really what we should be aiming for is to see government, wherever it happens to be, whether it's your local town council or whether it's at Westminster, reflects the communities that it serves. And I think, I'm sure we'd all agree, it currently does not do that at all. Just to give the example of being a woman leader of a council, we're a tiny, well, I think we're just about crept into double figures percentage wise, but there are very few women that lead councils, not to speak of where's our representation from, for example, our black and ethnic minority communities. So I think the things should be linked together to look at that representation. And I think looking at proportional representation, or however you want to do it, there is a possibility to have that conversation alongside that. So I think that's where the sort of look at it from a local government point of view is quite important. So really just to sort of say how we could play our part in this, I think we've got these very important local elections coming up next year, which I think the Labour Party, generally speaking, is seeing as a little bit test of where we are, to test the waters in our planning forwards towards 2024. So although electoral reform doesn't necessarily automatically come into a sort of manifesto of a local council going on for district elections, I do think there's a conversation to be had there about how do we tie all these elements together? How do we make it not just about Westminster? How do we make it about local government? The point I think Duncan made right at the beginning, I would absolutely echo. You know, we've been living and breathing the COVID crisis for the last few months, and what I've seen is, regardless of which party has been running local councils, how local councils have stepped up and have done every single thing that was demanded of them in really challenging circumstances has been quite incredible, and we should be celebrating that more. Absolutely responsive. I know we tend to think local councils are horribly slow and take ages to respond, but most officers and councillors responded. You know, they turned on a pin basically to get everything running. They kept services running. They responded to the most vulnerable and supported the most vulnerable in their communities. They helped local businesses, and they're continuing to do so. So a really good example. And as I mentioned before, as Duncan was saying as well, work really inclusively with all the political representation in their communities. Absolute stark contrast to what we've seen with central government. And I think, if you want to drill down into one of the major issues why they're failing, is the lack of ability to include the opposition and have a diverse decision-making body in there. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, they look to the Blitz and Boris Johnson looks to Winston Churchill as the sort of exemplar. Well, it was they had a Labour deputy prime minister, didn't they? So Labour was at the heart of the response as well. So I'll probably stop there because I'm sure you want to have questions and things, but hopefully that just gives you a flavour of what it looks like from local government's point of view. I think these questions are immensely important. I think as local councillors, you know, we're living on the front line of that all the time. And I would like to see more of a tying up of the two issues together, because I think, you know, we live in such difficult times. And I think there was a survey done by the Local Government Association recently in the last few months showing trust in local government is actually really high. So build on that resource. I think that's really valuable. Let's understand why that is compared to trust in central government, which is constantly ebbing away. And the danger is there, the less we have trust in our politicians, there's a huge amount of danger and where that ends up. So let's revisit what's going on in local government and use that to inform this debate, because I think there's some really valuable lessons to be learnt there, which hopefully will result in a positive outcome, which is getting some form of reform in this country. Thank you.
Doina, thank you very much indeed. That's fantastic. And I'm thinking about other local leaders at district level who've been admirable in the last few months. And Susan Brown at Oxford is one who I think of, leading the Oxford City Council there, which is threatened with closure if we go to unitary counties, and Stevenage as well with Sharon has been amazing, the co-op council there, and that's they've done a terrific job. Another thing that occurs to me is during the lockdown, large swathes of our country stopped altogether, but our bins never got missed. Our bin waste collection team were absolutely amazing and did a terrifically vital job. We couldn't allow the bins to just stack up, could we, during just because there was a little thing like a pandemic, and they went above and beyond, and they were just the front line of a whole swathe of council officers, many of whom had jumped into new jobs at a moment's notice, and did a brilliant job. And I know that local councillors in my area at least have been leading the volunteer effort, as well as encouraging the councils to step up. I'm very impressed by this idea that we're broadening the debates to the whole of electoral reform and not just PR in particular elections. I'm also impressed, and Doina's mentioned this as well, by the way that the party at the moment is gearing up for the May 21 elections as if they're important, and that's not something that we've always done as a party, and I think that's a really useful thing to do. If we're absolutely honest, we haven't had a stellar few years in terms of our local government performance, and we haven't as a party really pulled together to fight these elections. It's really good to see that's happening this time. There's been some great points made in the chat. I wonder if people would like to use the reactions button or to just wave if you've got your video on, if you'd like to make a point or ask a question at this stage. Would that be okay?
Can I interrupt, Duncan? Because actually it's far easier if you go to participants at the bottom of the page, and then you can click and raise a blue hand. If you don't do that, I won't know who to unmute.
Oh, okay, great. You go for it, Sandy. Sandy's very experienced at this sort of thing.
If anybody wants to do that, while we're waiting for somebody to raise their hand, because nobody has raised their hand so far, but while we're waiting for that, can I just say that I think, you know, whether or not Westminster is capable of working with local government actually does partly depend on the electoral system that we use for Westminster. And it's a point that Ruth was making, but I think it can't be overemphasized, that we have actually got members of parliament who represent 3 different local authorities, not 3 whole local authorities, but a third of one, a third of another, and a third of a third one. And under those sorts of circumstances, it makes it virtually impossible for members of parliament to work with local authorities, which is one of the reasons why I believe the government in Westminster pays so little regard to local authorities, doesn't work closely with them, doesn't listen to what they've got to say, and isn't actually as effective as it could be otherwise. We've got Stephen Curran, first of all.
Thanks, Sandy. I think the thing that really strikes me when we're talking about this across the country is that there's often the impression given that it's Captain Oates going out 100 years ago, and in terms of our candidates, if we were facing an electoral reform, you know, saying to our colleagues, I'm just going outside with maybe some time, and we're facing oblivion. The only reason we lose any seats is because we lose votes, whatever the system is, and the vagaries of the first past the post system just make it really amplified. And I think the Red Wall experience down south is a really great example of that, that the sense of entitlement a lot of us had in the party about being able to hold on to seats, particularly in Scotland, where we've never got over half the votes, and we're assumed to have had a strength in Scotland. We've never get more than 50% of the votes, and now really good MPs like Paul have lost out, largely because the voting system's totally slated against us. I put a point in the chat which is really important, particularly in terms of local government. In Scotland, we only have 1/5 of the councillors, but we're involved in more than 2/5 of the administrations of the councils. We also have a Labour councillor who leads the LGA equivalent in Scotland, Cllr, who represents Aberdeenshire, which is a very rural community. So with PR in Scotland and local government, we're able to represent communities we never had people elected in before. And also Glasgow, as Paul was saying, great example. Every single one of those 23 wards we now have in Glasgow were won by the SNP in the last council election 3 years ago. On the first past the post, there would be no Labour councillors in Glasgow if it had been a first past the post system, which is a huge disparity. When go back before 2007, we had 71 out of 78 councillors Labour, again on less than half of the votes in the city. So there's something about the fairness of vote and the fact that, probably for me, the important point is if it's a strong argument people feel, if most people have elected their representative, is that a good thing? For me, it seems an obvious one, and that's what we get with PR system. Thank you.
And we've now got Michael. Can't see his surname.
Hi there. Hello.
Hello, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Michael.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just trying to emphasise the importance of local government. Where I live, we suffer from 3 tiers of local government with county, district and town councils. And over the time I've been down here.
Where's that, Michael? Sorry.
Down in Devon. In Devon. Yeah.
Right.
Watching how politicians, elected representatives perform over a long, long time, I think that our major problem is one of representation. And I've heard over and over again people talking about local control, but to them it's a constituency or it's a district, not a town of just under 6,000 people. And just if I may, just to give you one example, at district level we have 2 councillors we elect. Once they get into power as the ruling body, they may well get portfolio responsibilities and then cannot speak on behalf of our town on those matters. How are we represented? And the second point about representation is that I was on town council for a long time, and I hope that I managed to put forward the positions of people I didn't agree with. If you represent people, you have to represent all of those people. So if you have somebody that says, for example, to be extreme, I don't believe we should have any more immigrants in the area, you have to put forward that point of view, even if you don't agree with it. And with party political appointees, they find it virtually impossible to do this because the party and allegiance to that party seems to come first. So I'm all for local being really local, power down to the town level rather than at some body in County Hall.
Thanks, Michael. I'm a former Labour mayor of Witney Town on Witney Town Council. I've never found being Labour a restriction on being able to voice views, but also to stand up for Labour values, I think is also part of that. But you're right. I like this idea of being able to take decisions as close as possible to the people they affect. And that's one of the principles that I think we all believe in electoral reform, as well as fairness of representation. Is there anybody else who wants to chip in here? We've had some very rich comments in the chat, incidentally, which we'll hopefully capture. And the other thing I wanted to do before we close, because we're going to close fairly soon, I think, is to invite you all to join the Labour campaign for electoral reform, which thank you, Ruth, for reminding people of that, but also to flag up that we're thinking about creating a local government network, if you like, within the Labour campaign for electoral reform. There's a very distinct agenda here, a series of ideas which feed into a broader discussion about the nature of our democracy, I think. And it would be really useful to be able to share your expertise and thoughts and ideas to come up with a proper, let's say, plan, but anyway, a series of proposals which will take forward some of the things we've been discussing today. I found this a really refreshing meeting. There are ideas shared here that I've never heard before at a Labour conference, and I think that it's definitely worth pursuing our contribution from local government into the kind of new constitutional settlement which our speakers today have all espoused so beautifully. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming, and thank you particularly to Paul, Mark, Ruth and Doina for your contributions, and for Sandy for running this. Please keep in touch. Lovely to see you all, and thank you very much indeed for coming.